Welcome to this roundup. The computer code, connected computers, and internet has heralded both beginnings and ends. Now, as the computer code and connected computers blur the line between cyberspace, geospace, and space, and as cyberspace is getting deeply embedded across each component of a nation, that is, its government, industries, organizations, and academia, its crowded interconnections bring complex, chaotic, and challenging time for everyone. Now, these growing interconnections and interdependencies raise an important question on whether our current risk management framework, tools, technologies, and processes are effective in identifying, evaluating, and managing the integrated risk. Now, since integrated risks are not even clearly understood, and when the computer code, connected computers, and the ecosystem that make the cyberspace begin to bring complex challenges and complexities to everyone and to everything from geospace to space, the question is whether we need a new way of identifying, evaluating, and managing integrated risk. To discuss managing integrated risk further, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Miles Smith to Risk Roundup. Dr. Smith is from Risk Advisory and Strategy Practice at Tracker Networks Canada. Welcome, Dr. Smith. We are honored to have you on Risk Roundup.
Very glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me to speak with you.
Wonderful, Dr. Smith. So, what do we know about the risks that are emerging from across cyberspace, geospace, and space due to connected computers, computer code, and internet? And when we start evaluating all these, risks that are emerging, the question emerges that who does cyberspace, geospace, and space belong to now, and who is accountable for managing the very complex interconnected risks that are emerging?
Well, it's a great question. It's a very broad one. I can tell you a little bit about the philosophy that we've formulated at Tracker, and that's resonated well with a lot of people. Is if it ever worked, the old model that you kind of build a fort around your enterprise and you keep threats or risks at bay using walls, so to speak, or blanket policies, is not really viable in a world of extremely wide-ranging and interconnected risk that can implicate or can impact your company at a third party or remote sphere of action. So things that happen remotely can trigger third-party risks that touch close to the center of an enterprise. And just from the narrower question of the data front, people's information and data are extruded now. They're not in systems. They're on iPads. They're on personal devices. They're accessible in countless ways. So I think the starting point for us was realizing what a broad and important business risk cyber risk is. What a general enterprise risk information and technology risks are. And that perspective was relevant to people like CIOs who were keen or willing to take a business-oriented perspective as opposed to just managing things like uptime. And also, I think, increasingly executives who might have gone through business training before technology and digital became such an important part of almost every kind of enterprise, began to realize that there were some questions that they needed to ask their CIOs that weren't of a purely technical nature, but related to not just the security, but the well-being, the reputation, the continuity, the operational viability of the company. And so that blurring line between cyber risk as a technical or geek area and business risk, which is touched by technology and rests on it in almost every way, led us to think from our background in cyber risk, cybersecurity, towards a more enterprise risk-oriented approach. And I think one of the most important lessons was that although people take different views of what enterprise risk is all about, it's almost always something which is on the one hand impacted by technology, and on the other hand is really enabled by culture. So means and measures and tools and protocols are one thing. Any kind of compliance or risk management framework is one thing. Some of them are necessary for regulatory reasons or for other necessities. But the the bottom line comes down often to resilience, the ability of an organization to identify its risks, to characterize them in a way that's accurate and communicable, and then to start looking at meaningful and viable responses.
Yes, very true. I mean, if we look at the enterprise now, the risks that are emerging within an enterprise, or the risks that we see are two different categories we can broadly define. One is independent risk that any organization, any entity, any enterprise can manage on its own, irrespective of what risk management framework they use or what processes they have. Independent risk they will be able to manage, but because of the connected computers in cyberspace and in the internet, the nature of the risks emerging, the interconnected, interdependent risks that are emerging, that there is no way there is any entity on earth, across any nation, that they will be able to manage those interconnected, interdependent, or integrated risks on their own, because there are so many interconnections and interdependencies. And at this point we just don't have any framework that can manage those interconnected, interdependent risk, and there is no organization that is looking at managing interconnected, interdependent risk. Now, because of cyberspace, it is not only the information security and the data security that is at risk, but basically each and every model, or the way we do things, the products, services, everything is at risk, because everything is being redefined and redesigned. So there are many different nature of risks that are emerging because of cyberspace. In not only cyberspace, but in geospace and space, the infrastructure is at risk, our space initiatives at risk, everything is at risk, because the computer code and connected computers is making everything vulnerable. So before we go into discussing all those risks, let's first talk about what approach nations currently are using to managing their integrated risk. From your assessment, what is the approach by how organizations are managing the integrated, interconnected risk?
Well, you made a couple of wide-ranging but interesting points there. I'll just touch on a couple that I think stand out. One is, I think, effectively you made the point that systemic risks, so risks that can threaten sectors of an economy or can threaten a nation or a big chunk of a society, usually emerge out of risks that aggregate at a small level. So, for example, if everybody's computers are unguarded and can be turned into bots, you get basically an aggregate effect of the security precautions or the basic risk management that ordinary people, small companies, companies of all size, either take or don't take. So I think a lot of policymakers are interested, among other things, in communicating steps that ordinary people can take to make resilience a little bit greater at the granular level, right? So I mean, if you look at a company, the percentage of people who keep their passwords current and strong and secure, or who don't, plug in found data sticks, things like that, those kind of really micro level habits affect the welfare of a company. And then as those habits are found across the organizations that make up a national economy, you get national and systemic risks effects, positive or negative, out of those small behaviors. I think you also made a point about technology as one category of enterprise risk management that is relevant not only because digital and technology touch so much more of what we do now, but also because of the velocity of it, right? So one dimension of risk in enterprise risk management discussions and elsewhere that I think you're hearing more about is the dimension of velocity, right? I mean, certainly there are risks that have high potential impact. There are risks that have high probability. There are the black swans, which might be seen as very low probability but very high impact. There are all those ways of framing and filtering out risks. But what cyber and information and technology risk have that I think a lot of executives and boards also are increasingly aware is a high velocity. And that means that if you've got a kind of risk management cycle that's annual or even quarterly, that's much, much slower than the cycle on which threats that aren't just technical, they're not just about downtime, but relate to reputation. You think about the Panama Papers stories, the kind of cyber incidents that make the front page of newspapers or the front page of the business section. Those things are very fast moving. So I think people are looking at ways to make their risk management cycle more agile, more continuous, ongoing, and nimble. And I think that one of the motivations for that, though not the only one, is the cyber dimension that you're talking about. And I'll just jump in on one other thing that I think you wanted to talk about for a couple minutes now, and that is that kind of continuity of space, right? And you think about the famous Stuxnet hacking in Iran was a combination of a lot of systems and software knowledge, and also an ability to breach air gaps. And a senior infrastructure executive, senior hydro executive here in Ontario and Canada, said that what he really worries about is the point where cyber or technology meets the human. Like, you've got a lot of remote or system edge technology, which could be systematically significant or cyber vulnerable. And if that is in a place that is remote but accessible to a bad actor, you've got a really complicated stack of factors that are spatial, as you said, they're logistical, they're mechanical, they're human in terms of what motivates or might incentivize a person to try to profit or otherwise do harm by either violating internal protocols or just coming in as an external bad actor. And then how does your technological posture stand up against that stack of threats? And I think that is a good summary of why the broad or global integrated risk management or enterprise risk management conversation is such a timely one now.
Yes, absolutely. It is a timely one, and it is much needed that we come up with an effective way, because cyberspace is not, it's a contested common. It is not, and we don't have boundaries in cyberspace that, the United States has this much cyberspace, that Canada has this much. It is a contested common, and any security risk can emerge from anywhere. All they need is the internet connection and, desire to harm others, irrespective of what component of a nation we are talking about. So as we evaluate all these emerging threats from across nations coming from cyberspace, do you see a need for a new way of identifying, evaluating, and managing risk? Because we at Risk Group very firmly believe that it is time that we reevaluate the very approach to risk management and redesign, and propose a robust, integrated cybersecurity risk management framework. And when I say cybersecurity, it is a framework that just not talks about cyberspace, or that just doesn't, address cyberspace risk, but also the risk emerging from geospace as well as space. So it's an integrated cyberspace, geospace, space, risk management framework. That is something that we very much need, that would give nations a capability to effectively research, review, rate, and report not only cyberspace and cybersecurity risk, but also geosecurity and space security risk.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things there to recoup a point that I didn't quite finish properly, and I think speaks to what you're saying is the old model of outside in defense, where the idea is that your data was all in one place, and you didn't want people penetrating a barrier to get at it. It's been replaced by this, what I was calling extruded data, where it's effectively everywhere, or it's accessible from an infinite or indefinite number of nodes. So it's not in a place that you can defend with a clearly defined perimeter and a limited number of access points. And that's led people to go from an outside-in approach to an inside-out, build from resilience, build from practices, focus on crown jewels, pay close attention to the things which reputationally and otherwise you don't want compromised, and focus on the ability to manage behaviors in an economized way, meaning focus people's limited attention and willingness to follow protocols on the things that really have the highest impact. So I think there's an inside-out approach that is local. The reason I bring that up is you're asking about what nation states and other governing bodies can do. And I think it's the right question, but at the same time, I think what we're seeing is ground up, bottom up, at least as much as top down, as being the place where we find the most effective solutions. Here in Canada, we had a lot of internal discussions, at panel dinners and at think tanks and whatnot, about the fact that we lagged behind some other developed economies in terms of the seriousness with which we were confronting really systematic, persistent cyber threats and other technology-driven enterprise threats. And one of the consultant-led proposals was to be a little better at risk sharing or threat sharing. That means collaboration among peers initiated on a peer-to-peer basis from the bottom up, not necessarily waiting for regulators to take the lead, and talk about not just the threats you were seeing, but the effectiveness of certain types of response. And sometimes that's just table stakes that companies can do. They're not in-house secrets. They're just practices that peers in a banking sector or in another important critical sector can share to reduce their own in-house risk and also systematic risk, risk that's contagious across the players in an economic niche, for example. I also think the bottom-up approach is important in terms of just gathering information about how external realities and external events affect an organization, right? Because I really think that thought-provoking ISO definition about the effect of uncertainty on objectives is helpful in some ways. It's not the first intuitive definition of risk you'd come up with. You'd normally reach for something like the probability that something would happen times the impact if it does happen. But if you really look at how risk works, it's about incentives, which means that the probability of a thing and the impact of a thing differ greatly by people's skin in the game. That's the new theme that Nassim Nicholas Taleb has pushed, and I think he's right to do so. So I think really local responses to risk make a big difference, whether it's someone who isn't properly incentivized to be vigilant, although they're a person with a lot of the information or perspective on a risk as it might emerge, or backing up, reinforcing, supporting the incentives that help people on the front line, not just in the audit part of a company, for example, to contribute insight into risk and to contribute to the mitigation cycle, because they're close, right? They're not at the top of a regulatory chain, but they're close to the operational realities, which is where the impact of a risk could be felt. I don't know if that resonates with the perspective you're bringing, but that's certainly what we're seeing in a lot of different ways, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we are proposing because see, risk vulnerabilities do not arise only from technology. It arises from inadequacies in governance or processes or management or investment regulations, insurance, culture, motivation, interconnection, interdependencies, and integration. So each and every individual and entity across nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia is now vulnerable to integrated risk. So we have to define the changes in the way we manage integrated risk because at this point if you look at how a lot of risk are managed is that when a corporation or entity comes up with identifies a risk that they think that they can is going to impact them, but it is better if they just transfer the risk, purchases the insurance policy, they transfer the risk from them, so they are not going to financially be impacted, and they think that the work is done, they don't have to worry about that risk anymore, and then those risks keeps becoming bigger and bigger. Now in the cybersecurity risks that are emerging, if we start managing like that, where we are not transparent and when we are not accountable to managing those risks effectively, in the sense that if organizations don't put effective risk management framework within their organization, if not everyone is involved in identifying all different risk variables, all different kinds of risk, and if they start just transferring the risk, then there is absolutely no way we'll be able to manage the integrated risk effectively. So this is a very different kind of risks that are emerging. The integrated risks that are emerging are very different nature. So do you see that risk management system needs the same holistic approach? Because if you look at that, irrespective of whether we are looking at cybersecurity system, geosecurity system, or a space security system, any and all systems needs to be evaluated holistically and collectively, and not merely as a sum of its parts. We cannot do silo risk management anymore. The nature of the risk emerging are very, very different and very complex. So we feel strongly that we need a holistic approach where everyone is involved and where we look at the risk emerging broadly, irrespective of whether at a global level, national level, or industry level, or enterprise level. We have to look at the risk very broadly because there are so many interconnections and interdependencies emerging.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it goes to two things at least. One is the importance of the distinction between having tools or having technology and having real risk management practices. And the other is the difference between having, say, a framework and having a risk culture. So, I mean, one very senior technology officer at one of Canada's leading hospital networks we spoke with was talking with us about tools that they might use to strengthen their risk management framework. And he made, I think, the very smart point that he didn't want to put in a tool first. He wanted to make sure that the culture is in place, because otherwise people would think that the tool would do the work. And I think that's an old IT department centered way of thinking that we're moving past, that's similar to the audit centric way of thinking. For one thing, it's not possible to rely solely on a checklist or a framework, no matter how well thought through. You know, the COSO frameworks, the ISO frameworks, a great deal of thought and experience and practice and aggregation of insight went into those things. But you can bolt those in and say that you have a framework, and that's not at all the same thing as having the ability distributed across the people of your organization to identify risks astutely, to prioritize them accurately, to think about the causes that feed into them in a sensible way, to look at the impacts that flow out of them in a way that's relevant to the perspective of the organization, and then to look at mitigations before and after events if there are any that are doable. So I think that calls for understanding that risk management is about the awareness and habits and practices, as well as processes of a team of people, more than it is about having some sort of framework in place. And it's also impossible to rely on some sort of mechanical guarantee, whether that's the presence of a protocol or the presence of some kind of tool or technology that's in place. The risk culture, which means in effect, I think, the incentives, predicts better than any other single thing how ready or how resilient an organization is in the face of a set of risks. That's a fairly pointed way of putting it, but I think it gets to the nub of what you're saying.
Yes, no, I agree with you, because at this point, I don't see that we have a culture of integrated risk management, or we don't have a culture of accountability. The responsibility that even individuals or entities, they feel that they are accountable for the risk emerging for within, from within their corporate boundaries, that they are responsible to manage those risks effectively and not just transfer the risk. That's why in our risk management framework that we have proposed, we have defined very clear, boundaries, that if there are risks that any organization can manage, that are emerging from within their corporate boundaries, and if it's possible for them to manage effectively, then those risks should never be allowed to be transferred. Those risks should never be allowed to be purchased insurance policy for that. If we don't come up with very effective processes of managing risk, or what are independent risk and what are interdependent risk, or what risk can be transferred, if we don't come up with those effective way, if we don't tie accountability to individual actions and decisions, if we don't come up with incentive structure, like, there are across nations, across every entity, people are identifying, risk. It's not that the risks are not identified, but a lot of risks are not reported. They're not, taken to the next level, because people feel that what is in it for them, why should they get involved in managing those risks, or reporting those risks, because it will just bring them a liability. So we do need to come up with a effective structure in which that there is an incentive for individuals or entities to report those risks, and then so that we can effectively that we can come up with an organizational structure where we can effectively manage those risks. But the culture of integrated risk management, of the culture of being accountable, is not that. And today everything across cyberspace, geospace space is at risk because of the connected computers and computer codes. And moreover, the approach to risk and how we manage risk is also currently largely reactive. And this reactive response approach limits, I feel, that entire nation's ability to have a proactive integrated risk management capability. And unless risk management becomes a collective proactive initiative, there will always be recurring incidents of crisis across cyberspace, geospace, and space, with varied levels of impact and intensity. So, do you see that? Is there a collective mindset and effort across any nation to manage their nation's integrated risk?
I mean, perhaps not, and perhaps one reason you could point to many is that I'm not sure that the textbook or benchmark example is being set at the stop at the top. So you mentioned the nation level management of risks, or just addressing culture. I think the fatalism and the sense of impunity that people associate with risks that people have, even though that can be catastrophic, people have gotten used to the risk of hacks, breaches, leaks, cyber incidents of all kinds, and other things. I think people are used to the idea that it's inevitable as opposed to something that you can ward off. So there's that sort of shorthand in terms of cyber breaches, that there are only people who have been breached and know it, and people who have been breached and don't know it. So a certain amount of fatalism has been perceived and communicated, in some ways rewarded, and that's maybe one of the incentives or drivers leading towards an insurance approach to some of those risks that just seem unaddressable. But also, I mean, if you look at in the United States, I think you might have congressional hearings involving a breach that affected, say, a government employee database, and the large firms that were partly responsible for that would get more government work, either to help patch the problem or just to go about their business, right? So I'm not sure that from the top down, we're necessarily communicating the best practices. And I think people individually and psychologically are astute. They perceive skin in the game. In other words, they perceive whether a risk really touches them. For example, are they going to be blamed or fired? And those kind of things are highly motivating. And they also can tell whether or not leadership, whether it's in their company or in their society or from the government level or the regulator level, whether leadership is demonstrating the best examples. And I'm not sure that's always the case.
No, I hear your point on that, and I see why there is the way we manage risk, that is out there, because, like you said, people feel that they don't have to get involved. That these things happens. I mean, I had a discussion with many decision makers from across nations, and I hear everyone saying the same kind of thought leadership, that there are certain things we can do, certain things we cannot do. But I feel that the connected computers and computer code has changed everything, because think about it today. Any brilliant, we are not talking only about the cybersecurity breaches or data security or information security breaches. That is just one aspect. Today, any brilliant computer scientist, or anyone with a desire to create, let's say, an entirely new organism from scratch using CRISPR technology, and ability to write the code itself, like a brilliant computer scientist can write a genetic code and create an entirely new organism. Sitting, synthetic biology, using that, people can create pathogens, and then wipe out any nation's agriculture, or can electronic warfare, any kind. The nature of the risk, complex risks that are emerging, cannot be managed with the mindset that we have currently. That, let's just look at the data security breaches. That is just a very small aspect. The nature of the risks that are emerging are so complex and so big that even the future of humanity is at risk now. So how is it, do we just have to sit back and wait and see, okay, let's just wait and see how the what kind of risks are emerging, and how organizations are managing, or how our top leadership is telling us? I think everybody needs to get involved from the bottom up. We need a framework which allows to identify, to research these kind of risks. The do it yourself movement and the democratization of information is bringing us so, I mean, while it is wonderful, it gives us a lot of potential of progress and development, it also brings us so many critical security risks. And with the current risk management framework that we have, there is absolutely no way we will be able to identify any of those risks emerging. What kind of malwares are being created? What kind of electronic warfare? What kind of pathogens are coming our way? Who is doing what? There is absolutely no way of knowing any of that with the current risk management framework. And we don't even have a common risk language. I mean, if you look at even the traditional risk management framework that we have, each and every nation manages the risk, in their own ways. There is not even a common risk language. So this is a very different time, and we have to be careful in how we manage in the complex challenges emerging because of the cyberspace, and manage the security risk emerging from that. So the question is, how can that be achieved when individual security currently is tied to collective, nation security? External security threats have ties to internal security threats, and interconnected, interdependent, integrated risk are simply ignored. So these are very complex. I mean, the risks that can be effectively managed are routinely transferred. Risk insurance is the most visible risk management tool, and most resources are spent on compliance over prevention and on management of risk. So this is a very complex, challenges that I see in the way we manage risk.
It's fair enough. I mean, of course, it's easy to get overwhelmed, right? Because the threat environment itself is not only replete with threats, but as we mentioned earlier, the velocity of threats is increasing on a number of fronts, and also they're coming from threats that are hard to categorize. I mean, they're coming from actors in the shadows using tools we didn't even know exist until they hit, all that stuff. So I think one of the ways that people who are experimenting in small and in large ways, and therefore maybe setting the risk management examples of the future that other people can emulate. One of the things I think that they're doing is taking an executive approach, which is to focus on the important things. So you remember that sort of Peter Drucker maxim that the executive approach is to focus on the thing where you can make the largest difference and dedicate yourself to that one thing at a time. I hope I haven't mangled that too badly, but you get the idea. You go from noise to manageable signal. And I think what a lot of people are doing is, on the one hand, broadening their listening spectrum. So they're not going to total risk democracy, where you just simply vote everything and make your decisions based on everyone's vote. But you are going outside the silo. You're going outside the audit function, outside the dedicated risk managers and the regulatory or legal department. And you are using simple things like workshops to gather everything from risk identification to causes and mitigations from people who have first-line knowledge. That's one thing. So you listen broadly internally to the people in your team, which are the people who you have a high trust environment with. Those are the people who can give you the best confidence, the best trust, the best insight. And they're also the best position to make a difference, the people who are close to you and are committed to the organization. So you start attacking your problems locally, and then you go a little bit more coarse-grained than these massive frameworks with 300 questions or hundreds or thousands of data points. I think at the audit committee level, some boards are starting now to say that they want to go beyond risk registers that might have dozens or hundreds of risks on them. They want to go to a top 10 or top 20 perspective, which can be a changing landscape of threats that are either critical or relevant or moving fast, and make sure that they've got a really business language narrative around those things. What's the nature of what we're worried about? Where are we positioned relative to that? What are the causes that we think we can at least identify and perhaps affect that feed into it? And what are the impacts that are really relevant to us that flow out of that? And what mitigations are available to sort of cut that risk down? I think whether you're the organization that's facing a risk, or even if you're an insurer who's dealing with sort of outsourced risk, so to speak, you're interested in moving to that more proactive footing. And that's happening at the local level. I think leader teams or champions inside companies, organizations that are benchmarks for their industry. And I think as that kind of experimentation on the essential gathers a bit of steam in adapting to this new environment that you're talking about, examples will be set that others can emulate. But I think we're already starting to see some patterns, and they relate to keeping the information living. So don't just have the strategy binder on the shelf or on the desk, but have an ongoing exercise that loops from identifying the risk through your mitigation exercise, your monitoring, and your review of how your practices and your capabilities and your efforts stand. Are they working? Are they not working? Who needs to be involved? Who needs to be given accountability? Who needs to be empowered to assume accountability? Because, of course, it's one thing to state that people need to be accountable. It's another to give them, at the very least, the voice and maybe the discretion to take actions proactively or reactively. But I do think you're right about one thing for sure. I think a lot of people, whether they're insurers or people who help put out fires, crisis management people, across a number of topical risk areas, are saying that they hear from people more post-incident than pre-incident. And I think it's in everyone's interest to move towards a culture where one of our corporate priorities is to build resilience and capability pre-event, to have a sense of what the events are that we most need to worry about, and to have kind of stand-up capabilities, or go bags, as they sometimes call it, for those key scenarios. It can make a big difference, obviously.
Sure.
It makes a difference in the look of reputation, but also just organizational continuity, business continuity.
Sure. I mean, it's not only reputation, but it's the survival and security or sustainability of all the initiatives, or organizations is at play here. So when we talk about integrated risk management, what do you see the organizations that you are dealing with? What do they mean by that? And how effective is their current risk management framework in managing integrated risk?
Well, one thing that's been really interesting for me is I've reached out to people in this area, enterprise risk management and integrated risk management, to get their opinion about what they think are the essentials worldwide. So I used LinkedIn, and I've heard from people from Ghana, from Israel, from India, from the United States, here in Canada, across Europe, whatnot. And on the one hand, it's clear that these are terms that mean a lot of different things to different people. Some people have more of a quantitative focus. Some people have a set of technical tools, and those are the tools through which they get some purchase on risk, especially risk that can be measured in terms of dollars or some other real hard measurable impact area. But apart from the diversity of perspectives on what it means and what it's about, in other words, what's the essence of it, you're seeing people looking to move up the maturity curve in terms of their ERM and IRM capability globally. So in all the places that I mentioned to you. And at the same time, I think there is this agreement that you can't do effective risk management without kind of quantitative insights. But at the same time, that kind of narrative, risk story is an important piece of the puzzle. Getting input, so a kind of structured or at least partial risk democracy, is important for a number of reasons. Not just because you want people to feel like they've had a say or to offer insights that might have been missed. Sometimes you have to make risks public in a way that you at least overcome the cost of discovery. Because when you think about the reputational aspect of risk, there is a behavioral incentive that exists sometimes that it is better to run into a risk event that nobody knew about than to have it happen and you knew about it and tried unsuccessfully to mitigate. So that's not always the case, but there's clearly a kind of psychological and real organizational cost of discovery where it's expedient not necessarily to have a candid inventory of risks. That's sometimes the case because of internal politics. It's sometimes the case because the organization, like a municipality, has public and political visibility. There are lots of reasons, but I think the value of a democratic approach to incentivize sunlight is an important part of that global perspective of getting out of the siloed approach you were talking about. And at the same time, I think that people are interested in anything that at least makes the kind of old-fashioned business case or value proposition that some of the financial service innovations offered. And just for example, if you're insuring risk and you can determine that there are overlapping or redundant costs of risk management in your organization, that's a cost-saving opportunity. If you do a 360-degree discussion, you may discover that you're either spending time, effort, and money on risk management that's beyond your risk appetite, so you're managing down to orange or down to yellow when you'd be happy to be at orange, for example, or there's just straight duplication, and there's a chance to save cost, time, and effort. So sometimes when you get to the paycheck, you have the kind of incentive you really want to make steps forward in your risk management practice. But I think ERM and IRM are topical worldwide now across every sector that I've seen, whether it's finance, whether it's health, whether it's industry and infrastructure, and it's global. So that developing economies, as they build banking capability, financial system capability, they're wanting to bootstrap up their IRM, ERM capability. And what I find is encouraging is the broader public sector is taking it seriously. So permanent organizations that might have a permanent government charter or mandate that might have been seen as being immune to risks in some ways that the private sector aren't, they're beginning to on their own initiative or with direction to take IRM and ERM more seriously, which is an encouraging development.
Sure, it is encouraging development, no doubt about it. It's the first good step. But do you see a need for an approach that addresses the changing nature of security risk emerging from cyberspace, geospace, space, or that addresses both independent risk along with interdependent, interconnected, and integrated security risk, and where the security risk ownership is clearly defined and where there is accountability for managing security risk and which prevents transfer of security risk and gives us an ability to identify interconnected and interdependent risks that and also provides incentive to bring accountability in individual action and decision, and most importantly that provides a framework that brings trust in the system. Do you see a need for all that?
I do see it. I mean, that's part of what we do now. We built our own software as a service tools to help make uh, getting the essentials done smoother, more agile, and simpler, and also to help with things like the visualization of risk data to make the impact and the narrative aspect stronger. But there's always a consulting angle around that, and actually, I think whether it's the large consulting firms or small operators, you see a very healthy ecosystem out there of risk management advisory, and I think there's a good reason for that. One is whether an organization, as it breaks out its key risks, wants to accept them or manage them or mitigate them or transfer the risk in one way or another, whether it's insurance or another tool, they need people who have a mix of sympathy and objectivity. So they're close enough to the in-house perspective, which makes risk relevant and real, but at the same time, they're not swept up in the day-to-day, which is one of the enemies of improved risk management practices. So I think for those who offer, whether they're bringing a framework or a system, or whether it's just a sympathetic and a sensible ear and some experience, I think that ecosystem of people like yourself who are consultants and advisors has a real role to play now, and it's obvious that companies, small-ish, mid-sized and large, put a lot of their trust in the kind of advisors who can translate, textbook answers and the terrain on the ground, because you've always got to cover that gap between the map and the terrain. You want to get to something like the map or the picture of the model risk management practice, but you've got to work with the people you have, the liabilities and situation of the organization, and you've also got to work with the entrenched habits and incentives that you may want to try to shape or mold or improve.
So how do we create such framework? What should be the premise, and who should lead such initiative?
Well, I mean, speaking from our perspective, I mean, I think at Tracker, we like to look for people who are looking to lead the way relative to the maturity of their sector. So they're looking to make a mark and set a good example by moving up the maturity curve, whether they're just bootstrapping a program almost from nothing or from spreadsheets and documents to something that's more living and dynamic and thoroughly connected in terms of making different pieces of information speak to each other. For example, people that are on the ground, mitigations that you're pursuing, actions that are outstanding, risks that may cover different business areas. I think a kind of collaborative approach involving consultants, tools, culture, and champions inside an organization, whether they're risk professionals or not, is a way forward, because I think success in that kind of risk management practice will be imitated just like other successful imitations are, whether they're technological or whether they're the design of the workplace.
Yes, very true. Now, the one of the bigger challenges that we see is because of the approach, how enterprises have been operating so far. If you look at it, any enterprise across, nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia, they largely operate in silo. We talked about that earlier, as individual and independent entities across nations, and these silo operations of these enterprises that is in existence today, it creates a barrier or obstacle to managing integrated risk. So, how can we change? How can we bring together a structure or a framework or an approach where we where we break all these silos and we come together, even if at a national level or an industry level, to manage the integrated risks that are emerging? How do we change that culture to manage to break those silos?
Well, I mean, I think I'll stand by what I said a little earlier, which is I think that the best determinant or the strongest single determinant is incentives. And so if you cannot create or shore up incentives that align with improved risk management practices, you're going to have trouble taking a step forward. But I'll also give it sometimes sounds like a kind of blanket or soft answer, but education, because it can sometimes be simple things that make a big difference, is often a good start. So I think, at the provincial level of government here in Canada, there's an initiative to educate directors and people who work under what we call our deputy ministers in simple things like the bow tie. And the value of something simple like that is that it has great narrative force, right? It's a very simple diagram, and it helps you think in a kind of linear or directional way about risk. It's one thing to name risks, but it's another to think, what is the actual event you're talking about? And then from that, how would you look to the causes that can either make that event more or less likely? And then in terms of the relevance of the event, post-event, what are the impacts that actually make that meaningful to us? And what does it mean to mitigate those things? So it's a simple tool, but if you have shared literacy across dozens or hundreds of people in an organization who suddenly have a reference point to make their conversations a bit more linear or at least more narrative, you'd have to be quite cynical, I think, to say that that could not have a positive impact, at least incrementally. Certainly, I think in terms of literacy, the ability or the willingness to look around corners a tiny bit, to start sharing insights from the front line where one person works against another. It's certainly something from a collegial standpoint that I do with my colleagues. And also, of course, a little bit of resilience, because I think if people at least have that kind of, duck and cover literacy about risk management, when something happens, they know how do they start zeroing in on the causes that are contributing or did contribute to this, and also, between now and the worst possible effects of what's happened, what are some of the impacts that can be met or cut off at the earliest point, right? So I mean, I think education is not as powerless a tool as we might be tempted to think.
Yes, very true. I mean, developing a culture of risk awareness is very, very critical and essential to the success of nations, especially in this digital global age. And that's the reason establishing integrated risk management framework that includes all components of a nation. That means governments, industries, organizations, academia, and even individuals, I think, is the way to build a risk conscious culture and society. But the question is how do we build that? How do we come up with a framework? While we have proposed a framework that would perhaps bring all these components together, it is still there are so many obstacles, challenges to be able to achieve what we define on paper. Because to define on paper is one thing, to put together thoughts and leadership on that is one thing, but to actually be able to implement that kind of framework is a whole another thing. And another important the critical point that I see, critical barrier, is that most organizations are actively focusing on financial risk, legal risk, compliance risk, operational risk, but the much needed focus on strategic security risk, which consists almost 70% of the overall risk portfolio, is non-existent. In my assessment, where as I see, entities across nations, how they manage their security risk. So understanding the strategic security risk due to changing global fundamentals and rapidly changing technology and rapid changes in service models, product models, global competition, and lack of effective governance is a vital necessity for every nation. So, do you see your concern about the lack of focus on strategic security risk?
Well, I think there is a response. I think there is an interest in it, and it's one way in which top-down initiatives can be helpful. I think you're more likely now to have a CEO or the C-suite, the top of the house, think of risk management as a strategic mandate, where if only by leading by example and communicating effectively, they need to put capabilities in place to improve the risk management resilience, the risk management muscle of the organization. And I think boards are increasingly curious and literate. And we talked about this, their desire to get meaningful briefings that are both timely and netted out to help them, from a governance perspective, not from a management or meddling perspective, stay on top of this really complicated space of multidimensional risks that surround and threaten any kind of organization, whether or not, even those ones which have been described as too big to fail. There's no doubt that there's a kind of scrutiny and accountability. Some of that comes from publicity. Some of that comes from what you might call political risk or reputational risk. But I also think at the same time, executives have their ear to the ground. So the sort of thing that's happening in a small and highly balkanized way right now, you and I are talking, this podcast format has been transformative in a lot of areas. It's taken a lot of areas of education outside the walls of the brick and mortar university, outside the campus. The same thing is happening professionally. People are pretty candid. I say this because I've spoken to people and communicated with people worldwide in different organizations, because I want to know how they defined ERM and IRM and what they thought was the essential. And I think people are sharing peer perspectives through platforms like LinkedIn much more broadly than they would have even 5, certainly 10 years ago. So that creates the bottom-up reserve of insights and just the communication and the hammering out of what some of the problems are and what some of the positive options in front of us are. And I think it behooves executives and boards to listen to that. And I think they are. I think they're attentive. They're keeping their ear to the ground so that they understand what's happening on the front lines. And at the same time, as I said before, but just to recap it, I think they see it as more and more important to set the kind of example that will underscore the incentives and the behaviors at the person-by-person level that will make a difference for an organization and systemically. I know you're focused on the sort of the idea of the nationwide resilience or the responsiveness and the accountability.
Yes, absolutely, and there is a hope in that. Now, as we evaluate the current state of integrated risk management across nations, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that effective risk management, integrated risk management, can only be achieved through collective, comprehensible, and consistent risk management framework, methodology, terminology, processes, and approach that is implemented by everyone, individuals and entities across nations, its government, industries, organizations, and academia. So, an effective cybersecurity risk management framework or an effective integrated risk management framework should motivate everyone to play a role in preventing and managing this risks that are emerging, the integrated risks that are emerging, and thereby contributing towards security for not only their enterprise but their nation, their industry, their nation, and the global community, the humanity itself. So, what would you like to tell our global viewers and listeners? What about your concerns where they need to focus, and especially those young minds who are very keen on making a difference, coming up with different models and structure and processes and framework and products to manage, not to come up with not only new way of doing things but also new way of managing integrated risk or security risk, emerging from within their nation or from across their nation's geographical boundaries.
Well, I guess one thing that I should say to sort of round out what we've talked about is think about risk in terms of upside as well as downside, right? So, I think we've spent most of our time, and it's understandable, today talking about managing the downside of risk. But of course, uncertainty is usually an opportunity as well as a threat, and so whether it's the chance to determine whether you're overreacting to some risks, or whether it's the opportunity to effect savings or secure wins by exploiting the uncertainty around a risk event that others don't see. there's a lot of kind of buccaneering opportunity in the world of risk. And I mentioned that because you said, if you want to say something to the world, so to speak, I think people are often inspired more by the opportunity to achieve something positive and unprecedented, as much as they are by avoiding disaster. In some ways, people are more inspired by the idea of getting upside than avoiding downside. And I think, that goes back a little bit to that ISO definition of uncertainty and objectives. Uncertainty creates normally opportunities to realize objectives that an absolutely fatalistic environment wouldn't have. So there are good and bad examples of people capitalizing on risk. I mean, I think there's a case to be made that the financial crisis around 2008 involved people capitalizing on risk in a way that's not always admirable. But I think looking at risk as a chance, an area where you can work and think and contribute towards upside or value add is one of the more inspiring ways to think about the risk management process, the risk management practice. I think that was transformative for the finance function in a lot of companies some decades ago. And if you think in a very woolly or gauzy or abstract visionary way for risk management in the future, it may make its biggest splash by achieving measurable upside. I think if you build a better mousetrap in that way, some way that's dollarized, certainly the world will pay attention.
Yes, very true. Now, we always have to talk about, we have to identify the risk and we have to identify the vulnerabilities. We have to talk about the downside. There is absolutely, a need to discuss the upside. We need to discuss about the objectives and goals and where we see opportunities to making our current processes, our framework, and our models, much more stronger that can bring us resilience for the age that we live in. And there is, not enough time to talk about all of that in 1 hour discussion. But we discussed, very broadly about if we have effective framework to manage the integrated risk and why we need to come up with an effective framework and what needs to be the parameters of that. We were able to cover that very broadly, but there is certainly probably 1 more hour we can spend on this to discuss about how the current frameworks that we have, what strengths they bring, and where we need to reevaluate and redefine the certain components of it so that we can manage, we can bring more effectiveness, more resilience in our risk management frameworks. Because I think that probably we have the meaning of risk management is itself a little bit we have moved away from that, what actually should be we doing when we try to manage the risk. So we have to come back and clearly understand what risk needs to be managed, what actually risk management should mean, and whether we are actually making effort to do that. So having said that, thank you so much, Dr. Smith, for participating in Risk Roundup today. We appreciate your thoughtful insight on managing integrated risk, and I'm sure our global viewers and listeners will benefit tremendously from the information you shared on the need for managing integrated risk and the current state that you see across nations. So, even if a single individual or entity can manage that integrated risk effectively based on the discussion we had today, this Risk Roundup dialogue has been of service, and we thank you for that.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Wonderful. So, Risk Roundup, a global initiative launched by Risk Group, is a security risk reporting for risk emerging from existing and emerging technologies, technology convergence, and transformation happening across cyberspace, geospace, and space. We at Risk Group believe that risk management, security, and peace, they all walk together hand in hand. Though security is related to management of threats and peace to the management of conflict, risk management is related to management of security vulnerabilities as well as management of conflict. And it is not possible to conceive any one of the three without the existence of the other two. All three concepts feed into each other. We believe that the security we build for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secure for everyone across nations. Tradition becomes our security, so if we build a culture of managing risk effectively, it will lead us to security, and security will lead us to peace. Let's manage the existing and emerging risks together. For more information on the Risk Roundups, to watch the Risk Roundup webcast or hear the Risk Roundup podcast, please go to riskgroupllc.com and do not forget to subscribe and share. Until next time, I'm Jayashree, host of Risk Roundup, signing off. See you next time. Thank you.